A web of secrets. The Fairweather family's downfall. Emily and David Reynolds' love story seemed straight out of a fairy tale. They first met as college students at Creekside College, Emily majoring in art, and David pursuing a degree in business administration. From the moment David saw Emily by the campus lake, he was enchanted by her. Tall, charismatic, and irresistibly charming, David won her over with his determination and persistence. After graduation, they wasted no time and got married, eager to start their life together in their hometown. In time, David climbed the corporate ladder, gaining recognition and wealth, while Emily became a beloved high school art teacher. Together, they were pillars of their community, admired by friends and neighbors alike. Their beautiful home in Oakwood Estates, bought with David's growing wealth, became a symbol of their success. Emily's artistic touch was everywhere, in the hand-painted murals in the living room and the carefully selected sculptures in the backyard. To those who knew them, David and Emily seemed like the perfect couple. His business acumen balanced by her creativity, his tough exterior softened by her warmth. Friends often commented that their love still seemed as fresh as it had been in their college days. But beneath the surface, things weren't as perfect as they seemed. For years, Emily and David had been trying to have a baby, but without success. The emotional toll of infertility and failed treatments began to wear on their relationship. David buried himself in work, spending more and more time at the office, while Emily, feeling increasingly isolated, turned to her art and her students for solace. During this difficult period, Emily's bond with her mother, Martha Collins, grew stronger. Martha, a widow living just outside of town, had always been a free spirit. In her younger days, she had traveled the world as a photojournalist. After Emily's father passed away, Martha retreated into a quieter life, spending her days tending to her garden and volunteering at a local animal shelter. As Emily spent more time with her mother, David was gradually drawn into Martha's world too. What started as casual conversations over family dinners slowly became something more. David and Martha's affair began one crisp autumn evening. Emily was preoccupied with preparing for an upcoming art exhibition featuring her students' work. Feeling neglected and frustrated by the growing distance in his marriage, David decided to visit Martha's cottage alone, under the pretense of checking on his mother-in-law. Martha was surprised by his visit, but welcomed him with a smile and a glass of her homemade wine. As they sat together in her cozy, cluttered living room, surrounded by souvenirs from Martha's travels, David began to open up about his marital troubles. Martha listened sympathetically, her eyes so similar to Emily's, full of understanding. Maybe it was the wine or the intimate setting. But that night, a boundary was crossed. A comforting touch lingered a little too long, and a shared glance held more meaning than it should have. By the time David left, they both knew something between them had changed. In the weeks that followed, David and Martha found excuses to see each other more often. Martha would ask for help with small home repairs, and David, suddenly interested in gardening, would visit her frequently. These secret meetings became more frequent, always planned carefully to avoid raising suspicion. During one of their encounters, David went to fix a leaky faucet at Martha's cottage. As they worked side by side in the cramped bathroom, the air between them thickened with tension. When their hands brushed accidentally, it sent sparks through both of them. On another occasion, Martha was teaching David how to prune her rose bushes, standing close behind him to guide his hands. The warmth of her body and the brush of her breath against his neck sent shivers down David's spine. When he turned to ask her a question, their faces were just inches apart, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. The affair deepened when they stole a moment alone during a family gathering, hidden from view behind a trellis of climbing roses in the garden. They gave in to their desires, their kisses desperate, filled with the thrill of secrecy and stolen moments. When they heard family calling for them, they quickly straightened their clothes, trying to compose themselves. The guilt came immediately, but so did the excitement. Their affair consumed them both, their physical attraction growing into a dangerous emotional entanglement. What began as a secret passion turned into something more serious, with David and Martha even imagining a future together, despite the destruction it would cause their family. They justified their actions, whispering conversations with David complaining of feeling unappreciated by Emily and Martha, confessing to a loneliness that had haunted her since her husband's death. They convinced themselves that what they shared was special, something that went beyond the normal rules. As the affair deepened, so did the web of lies they spun to keep it hidden. David started inventing business trips and late-night meetings, while Martha pretended to be sick to avoid family events. They communicated using a secret email account and disposable phones, always careful not to leave any evidence behind. Yet with every lie, the weight of guilt became heavier. David found it harder to look Emily in the eye, and Martha's relationship with her daughter became increasingly strained. What had once been a source of comfort for Emily was now poisoned by betrayal. Neither David nor Martha could foresee the disaster their actions would eventually bring upon the Fairweather family. Even as they continued their affair, they remained blind to the growing suspicions in Emily's mind. The first hint came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when she decided to surprise David with lunch at his office. When she arrived, his secretary seemed confused, saying that David had left early for a supposed meeting with a client. Emily initially brushed off the incident at David's office as a simple misunderstanding, but something deep inside her began to shift. A seed of doubt had been planted. Over the following weeks, subtle changes in David's behavior started to catch her attention. He seemed distracted, often lost in thought during their conversations. His phone would buzz at odd hours, and he would step out to take calls in hushed tones. When Emily questioned him, David brushed off her concerns, blaming everything on work stress and important business deals he was handling. Emily's artistic nature, usually her greatest joy, now felt like a burden. She began to notice small details that others might easily overlook, like the unfamiliar scent of perfume clinging to David's clothes, or a faint lipstick stain on a coffee mug he had brought home from work. The way he sometimes avoided her touch didn't go unnoticed, and each observation added another layer to the picture she desperately didn't want to believe. At the same time, her relationship with her mother, Martha, started to shift. Martha, who had always been eager to spend time with her daughter, suddenly seemed distant and preoccupied. Their weekly tea sessions, once a comforting ritual, became infrequent, with Martha often canceling at the last minute, citing other commitments. When they did meet, Emily noticed something off. Her mother seemed nervous and avoided looking her in the eye, a stark contrast to her usual open and warm demeanor. As doubts gnawed at her, Emily found herself caught in a whirlwind of suspicion and self-blame. She started to question everything, every word, every glance, every interaction between David and her mother. Was she overreacting? Was the stress from their struggles with infertility and the pressures of her upcoming art exhibition making her paranoid? Determined to uncover the truth, she began to investigate on her own, quietly. Emily looked through David's credit card statements, finding charges for restaurants and hotels he had never mentioned. She began driving by her mother's cottage at odd hours, her heart sinking each time she saw David's car parked down the street on nights when he had claimed to be working late. Each new discovery felt like a blow, slowly chipping away at the foundation of trust that had held their marriage together for so long. At school, her students and colleagues noticed a change in her as well. She became more withdrawn, the dark circles under her eyes growing more pronounced. When she demonstrated painting techniques, her hands shook slightly, and the smile she offered to others never quite reached her eyes. As days turned into weeks, Emily became a shadow of her former self, trapped in the agonizing space between confronting her worst fears and clinging to the hope that she was somehow wrong. But the truth was far worse than she had imagined. The day that would shatter Emily's world began like any other. It was a Saturday morning, and she had spent the day at the school putting the finishing touches on her students' art exhibition. David had left early, muttering something vague about playing golf with clients. As Emily drove home, her mind wandered to the final details of the exhibition. But on a whim, she decided to stop by her mother's cottage. Perhaps a quiet cup of tea and some time with Martha would ease her restless nerves. Turning out of the quiet lane that led to her mother's home, Emily's heart stopped when she saw David's sleek black sedan parked outside. For a moment, she sat frozen in her car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. She told herself there had to be an innocent explanation, but deep down, she knew the truth. With trembling legs, she got out of the car and approached the cottage. The curtains were drawn, but through a small gap, she saw movement inside. Taking a deep breath, Emily unlocked the door with her key and stepped inside as quietly as possible. What she saw next would be etched into her memory forever. There on the floral couch were David and Martha, locked in an intimate embrace, completely unaware of the world around them. Martha's hair was disheveled and David's shirt was half unbuttoned. On the coffee table sat 2 half-empty glasses of wine, silent witnesses to their betrayal. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Then, as if sensing her presence, David and Martha turned to look at her. The shock, guilt, and a fleeting hint of defiance on their faces were undeniable. The silence shattered when Emily's anguished cry filled the room, startling the pair. David jumped to his feet, stammering apologies and excuses, while Martha remained seated, her face pale and tear-streaked. Emily, her voice raw with pain, demanded answers. The truth came out in pieces, each word a dagger to her heart. It had been going on for 6 months, starting as a friendship and then evolving into something more. They hadn't meant for it to happen, and they were sorry. But sorry wasn't enough for Emily. Unable to bear their presence any longer, she fled the cottage, driving aimlessly for hours as the scene replayed over and over in her mind. By the time she returned home, the sun had set, casting long shadows across the lawn of the house that had once been her sanctuary. Sitting in the darkened living room, surrounded by reminders of the life she had built with David, Emily felt something inside her snap. The pain, the betrayal, the weight of their lies, it was too much. And in that moment, a cold resolve began to form in her heart. Someone would have to pay for this, and Emily knew exactly who it would be. What happened next unfolded over the course of several tense hours. Emily, consumed by grief and rage, paced the halls of her home like a caged animal. The ticking of the clock seemed to mock her, each second counting down to the moment when everything would change. As dusk fell, David returned home. He entered cautiously, his usual confident demeanor replaced with hesitance. Emily watched from the shadows as he hung up his jacket and loosened his tie, the familiar routine now tainted by his betrayal. When David called out for her, his voice strained with guilt, Emily stepped into the light. The woman standing before him was not the same loving wife he had known. Her eyes were red and hollow, her body stiff with barely contained fury. David, his face filled with desperation, began offering excuses, speaking of feeling neglected, overwhelmed by work, and worn down by their struggles to conceive. He insisted that the affair had been a terrible mistake, a moment of weakness that had spiraled out of control. Emily felt her anger rising like a wave of fury that threatened to consume her completely. Without fully realizing what she was doing, she found herself walking toward David's study. She knew he kept a handgun in the desk drawer, a precaution he insisted on after a string of break-ins in their neighborhood. In a daze, Emily opened the drawer and took out the gun, feeling the cold weight of it in her hand. When she returned to the living room, David's face went pale with shock and fear. His eyes widened as he saw the weapon. Raising his hands in surrender, he slowly backed away, his words coming out in a panicked rush. He begged her, promising to end the affair, to go to counseling, to do whatever it took to fix their marriage. But Emily barely heard him. In her mind, she could only see the images of David and Martha together, their betrayal playing over and over like a nightmare on repeat. What happened next unfolded in a blur. David lunged toward her, perhaps in an attempt to disarm her. In that split second of chaos, with emotions running high, Emily's finger tightened around the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the quiet room, and for a moment, the only sound that followed was the delicate tinkling of shattered glass as a picture frame fell to the floor. David staggered back, a look of disbelief on his face as he clutched his chest. Blood seeped through his fingers, staining his crisp white shirt a deep red. He collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, his wide eyes locked on Emily in a silent plea for help. The reality of what she had done hit Emily like a freight train. Her anger dissolved instantly, replaced by a tidal wave of horror and regret. She dropped the gun, hearing it clatter to the hardwood floor. The sound jolted her out of her shock. Rushing to David's side, Emily pressed her hands against his wound, desperately trying to stop the flow of blood. His breathing was shallow, his skin growing pale as life seemed to drain from him. With shaking hands, she reached for her phone and dialed 911. Her voice trembled as she pleaded for an ambulance, giving the dispatcher their address. Her words were barely coherent through her panic. As she waited for help to arrive, Emily cradled David's head in her lap, whispering apologies and begging him to hold on. It felt like an eternity before the paramedics arrived, even though it had only been minutes. Neighbors, alerted by the sound of the gunshot, began to gather outside. Through the window, Emily could see their curious faces peering in, expressions shifting from concern to shock as they took in the tragic scene. She could hear muffled voices, someone shouting to call the police. The paramedics worked quickly, doing their best to stabilize David. Emily stood off to the side, numb with shock, as they loaded him onto a stretcher and rushed him to the waiting ambulance. The wail of sirens faded into the distance, leaving her alone in the house, surrounded by the remnants of the life she had shattered. It wasn't long before the police arrived. Detective Mia Davis took charge of the scene, her sharp eyes surveying every detail as officers moved in to secure the area and collect evidence. Detective Davis approached Emily, who sat frozen on the blood-stained couch, in a calm but firm voice. The detective informed Emily of her rights and asked if she understood what had happened. Emily, her voice barely above a whisper, recounted the day's events, the discovery of the affair, the confrontation, and the moment when the gun went off. Throughout her statement, she sounded almost detached, as though she were describing something that had happened to someone else. When Emily was led away in handcuffs, the full weight of the situation finally began to sink in. She caught glimpses of her neighbors watching from behind their curtains, their faces a mix of horror and fascination. Meanwhile, at the hospital, David Reynolds clung to life in the intensive care unit. The bullet had missed his heart by inches, lodging dangerously close to his spine. As he underwent multiple surgeries, a steady stream of colleagues and family friends gathered in the waiting room, their hushed conversations filled with disbelief and speculation. Martha Collins, racked with guilt and shame, tried to visit David, but the Fairweathers family turned her away. She retreated to her cottage, refusing to answer calls or open her door. The weight of her role in the tragedy seemed to age her overnight, her once vibrant personality now hollow and haunted. Detective Davis continued her investigation, interviewing friends, colleagues, and family members, trying to piece together what had led to that fateful night. The more she uncovered about the Fairweathers' history and the affair between David and Martha, the more complicated the case became. As word spread through Creekside, the town became divided.